It looks like the Chinese companies, right? We call them Chinese.
And there'll be others from other countries,
Others,
yeah,
right?
right?
They are general agent companies that are fast and are out there with a lot of capabilities. But the question is, how accurate are they? How resilient they are? And how much differentiation they're going to have over time, right? And for the enterprise, these companies may actually not register. Welcome, Sam, to San Francisco. It's the first time we've seen each other in person.
Thank you. It's really nice to be here. It's a beautiful day outside too.
Yeah. And you're going to be headed to Google next.
And yeah, I'm in town this week for some meetings, and then next week we're in Vegas. You're coming over as well?
Coming over, and we'll probably do a podcast there. So looking forward to it. But today we wanted to talk about the emergence of these super general agents. There was first Manus, right? And then yesterday there was this company, Gens Spark, which launched super agents. And these are general purpose agent companies that basically do a lot of the tasks autonomously. So it moves beyond the chatbot and it's going and doing, travel itineraries, being able to actually speak with hotels on the phone and making a booking. For example, Manus is based in China. GenSpark is from Chinese founders. I think they're based in Palo Alto, though, but they were researchers at Baidu, the Chinese search company, so have a lot of experience there. But basically, they look like they're doing agentic tasks better than anyone else. So will the Chinese companies win the agent war?
So it's a really interesting place to sort of look at. At the moment, we've kind of got a few different ways that enterprises can do agents. We've got like they either go sort of the, Microsoft Copilot where it's all done for you. We've looked at that a few times throughout these. You've then got the startups, that are sort of coming along, like we were talking about Manus, like GenSpark. And then you've got, the sort of providing your own developers to custom do it for your organization. So it is really interesting that I guess both of us, maybe certainly myself, thought that some of the big tech companies would be doing what the Manuses and what this super agent from GenSpark are doing. Yet it seems like startups are winning, right? That's a really interesting take that we can sort of look at and just look at like what else is going on around these things.
Right. Well, let's dig in chronologically. So really, the big surprise was about a month ago, right? When Manus, maybe just even 3 weeks ago, right? Manus launched, Chinese company, took everyone by surprise. Like, how is this Chinese company that is not one of the leading US tech companies able to, manage 100 social accounts at the same time and tweets and so on autonomously, and then go to databases and then make itinerary searches for travel. So Manus it's from a company called Monica, which is linked to a company called Butterfly Effect in Wuhan, China. Did things like analyzing stocks and screening resumes, a host of things that people were doing. And it integrates things like a web browser, code editor, data management systems, but it also works autonomously in the cloud. So you can take, I think the founders that you could actually close your desktop and walk away as it was doing things autonomously. It has the memory to learn things like, hey, you want a spreadsheet for screening resumes instead of just a Word document, and then it'll come back and do that for you the next time. So Sam, I think the final thing is it turned out that Manus was using technologies from Anthropic and other large language models, but basically just doing agentic work more efficiently. Right.
So the really interesting thing about Manus was that a lot of the parts or the components to it, like the web browser and things like that, were just off the shelf open source parts. And so I think they had something like 27 different tools or something like that. And it turned out that they basically were just using everything really well. So it wasn't hugely sort of, that they'd come up with something totally new. It's just that they'd taken the stack that was out there and basically got it all to work in a way much better than anyone else. And I think people were really surprised because at the start, people were talking about like, oh, they must have some really cool tech or they must have some kind of model. And when people started to, jailbreak it or play with it, in those kind of ways, it turned out that actually, like you said, it was using Anthropic, right? It was using like people managed to extract some of its prompts, and to actually see how it was using a bunch of the things like browser use and stuff like that. But I still think it is kind of cool that it just shows that these things can be put together and they can be made to do something that's much more general than say what Copilot's done. Like we've talked about, Copilot having their own sort of researcher, their own sort of analyst, their own sort of inventory agent, that kind of thing in the past. But having something that's general that people could just send off and it could go and do all these things, I think that was a kind of breakthrough that Manus did, much better than we'd seen. Even companies like LangChain, like the framework makers who've tried to sort of demo these things, they've never got it as good as what Manus did. And now also, the super agent, the new one that's just out.
Yeah. Yeah, and as you say, better than OpenAI on the Gaia benchmark, right? The Gaia benchmark being this benchmark that measures the ability to do automated real world tasks with an agent, right? And I think we also talked about how OpenAI opened its agents SDK in part because it potentially saw that players like Manus were able to do things better. So why not open their SDK to allow others to innovate? But yeah, you bring us up to Gens Spark, which launched Super Agent yesterday, and they did something interesting, which provoked I think a lot of people to take note, which was they added this module for a voice agent to actually make calls, right? So not only are they researching, using maps and then public transportation information to do that itinerary and looking at data sets for what are the fun things to do in San Diego, but they actually have a voice agent that can get on the phone and actually book the restaurant for Tuesday evening, and then the hotel
So
for the following evenings.
So but that was a whole throwback to, if you remember Google I/O, I think it's like 2018 or something,
Yeah.
where Google showed this, I've forgotten the name that they had at the time, but Duplex, I think it was, yeah, Google Duplex. And it was, people were just blown away. I was sitting in the audience and like you could just hear people gasp when they saw this thing basically book a haircut and do these kind of things. And I think like in the end, Google couldn't roll that out as much as they wanted to, not for any tech reason, but because it just freaked people out, right? People didn't like the idea of that, someone would be calling them up that wasn't a real person, and that, and it just shows how much things have changed now, sort of 6, 7 years later. It is kind of fascinating that, though, also to look at that tech and see like one of the things that Google had going for it back then was it was almost like they had these individual agents, like one that could do a haircut, one that could book a restaurant sort of booking, and they were always the customer. And if you think about it, that was a big advantage to them. Then the customer's always right. So if I say something wrong and you're the person like serving me, you're going to try and get the agent back on track for me, right? And I think that GenSpark has really sort of picked up on that idea as well and run with it. And it looks like they've done a really good job.
The founders are Chinese executives formerly at the search company Baidu, Eric Jing and Kei Zhu. Companies based in Palo Alto, a lot of Singapore funding, 9 differently sized LLMs working. I think this concert of agents concept, 80 plus tools that it has access to, and 10 plus premium data sets they talk about. And they say that they've gotten 87.8% on the Gaia benchmark, beating Manus, beating everyone else, right, in terms of the ability to do these real world problems, right? So has anyone actually checked that? Has anyone actually done a test? No, right? Just came out yesterday.
I kind of feel that again these benchmarks are pretty irrelevant in this kind of sense because you're just seeing incremental things. Probably the thing that's more interesting is that one, they're using so many more tools, right? So I we kind of know that like to get these things to be really general, you really probably want to have hundreds of tools, right? Yet the problem is when you have hundreds of tools, you're confusing the model as to which tool it should pick. So there are lots of people trying different ideas where they use MCP servers with like a vector store to sort of look up the right set of tools and then provide that to the model so that maybe you're only providing like, 6 or 7 at a time rather than 150, or in their case, like, 80. So I think that's really interesting that, one, they were expanding the tools. The other thing I found really interesting was this whole idea of data sets, that they seem to have something kind of proprietary in this data that they've got together to be able to make it, work better. So, that they're not relying purely on a frontier model. They're not relying purely on these tools. And I think that's going to be a big win for them.
Yeah, one of the things I found fascinating, you tested it as well, the chain of thought right? The tracing as it showed what it was doing was fascinating for me. I actually used it to prepare for this podcast, right? Where I was saying, hey, do some research on the leading agents out there. What are they doing? What are the general purpose agents, and compare it to what the leading US tech giants are doing. And it showed, these traces of thought where it was very significantly finding sources on the leading news around agents, then doing parallel searches, going deeper, going to websites from Manus and Gens Spark, looking going deep, specifically trying to find the differentiation, and very impressive chain of thought, which I don't think has actually been talked about too much. But it's similar to what we talked about last week, where Google, with its model, has this thought patterns that are impressive, allowing you to see how it's working through these problems. This is the first one that I've seen where the agentic flow is so nicely patterned out. Did you get the same impression?
So I had to play around with it. So I have a couple of things that I test these things on. One of them is to go and find a whole bunch of emails and stuff. I'm not going to say what it is because I don't want people to optimize for it.
Yeah.
But it's basically to go and find a group of people, get their names, get some information about them, and get their email addresses. And so far, out of all the deep researchers, none of them have been perfect, right? Like some of them can get some of the information. Surprisingly, each of them gets different information, which I find fascinating. With this one, again, they found, some of the information, they didn't find all of it. But yeah, it was interesting looking at their traces. So my guess is that they're probably using one of the DeepSeek things for that, because we know, for example, that the Gemini thinking models just don't give the thinking tokens in the API, right? They only give that sort of, final answer. We know that the same for OpenAI, right? They don't give the thinking tokens. Okay, so you've got Anthropic that, they could be using, I guess, for that. My guess is that they may have, fine-tuned some of the things from DeepSeek. Certainly, if they're using multiple models, that in some ways is kind of more interesting. Like, have they worked out that certain models are good for certain things? And if, and I think that's something that lots of people have noticed, for example, with the new Anthropic 3.7 Sonnet, is that, yes, it's good at coding, but it's too damn eager, right? To just jump in and do stuff. And a lot of people are starting to go, yeah, maybe, I'll kick it off with 3.7, let it go for it. But then after that, I'm going to use 3.5. And so I think this kind of, intuitions that people are picking up really are very important, because it allows, if you've got a whole bunch of different tasks and you know that one model is really good at doing that travel search and doing, those kinds of things, it makes sense for this. We should point out that one of the things about GenSpark is that they've clearly got a sort of history in a search. They come from Baidu, which is a big search company in China, but also apparently they originally, when they got started, they were trying to basically build a Perplexity kind of competitor. And it seems like now they've only just pivoted from that to the full agent space.
Right, and they've raised quite a bit of funding. I think like over 100 million in funding as of last year. So they've got some serious capital. One of the things that are driving the capabilities right now of this agent use is the wider adoption of MCP, or the Model Context Protocol, which is allowing agents to then interact with other tools, also from China, right? Some real interesting research from Suzhou University around chain of tools, right? Co-tools, right? Which is a novel framework designed to help large language models use external tools better. To your point, the idea is to use more tools, but traditionally that has been a problem, because the more tools you give an LLM, the more confused it gets, and you can fine tune the model to a certain extent to use certain tools in certain circumstances, but then that actually then creates a model that starts getting confused on its own capabilities. And so there's now this new research allowing better reasoning across tools. So I think that's another reason you're seeing this. But I think it's interesting, Sam, that you mentioned that the leading labs in the US are coming out with a lot of these capabilities, like obviously state-of-the-art models. But what that's allowing these companies to do is to have the freedom to experiment with models. Meanwhile, Google is trying to make sure it's using its model, Gemini 2.5 or Flash, for its agents, right? Microsoft's doing fine-tuning with its partner, OpenAI. But you're right, and these agents are allowed to use whatever model they choose, whatever's best for the occasion. So so let's talk about what are the US labs doing? Why are they behind? Is there a good reason for that?
Look, I think there's probably a few reasons. I think one of the reasons may be that they just don't want the embarrassment, especially for someone like Google, of putting something out that's saying, hey, this can go and do something, and it ends up doing something totally wrong, right?
Yeah.
You don't want it sort of telling it that you want to get it to book a haircut, and then it books the Brazilian wax for you, right? That's probably not the sort of best thing, right? And you know that people are going to punish Google on Twitter for anything like that. Same for, some of the other tech companies. So I think that's one thing. I think you made a really good point about the models, right? That each of these companies has their own models. So they're sort of committed to, they have to use their own models. And if, as we're sort of seeing, that each of these models kind of has a personality. And if that personality then translates to them being good in a certain context, then, really, having the ability to choose models actually is a bigger advantage than people think. So, that's certainly one of the things. I think, one of the, I think MCP is really interesting to sort of look at. MCP, was proposed now 4 months ago by Anthropic. At the time, people just weren't that interested in it, right? I did a video about it. I think the video did okay or something like that. But everything died down very quickly about it. Yet in the past 2 weeks, people have just gone nuts about MCP. So we should point out, like, MCP stands for Model Context Protocol. The whole thing with these models is what can you actually put in that context window to get the output that you want. And so most people think of MCP as being for tools, which it is, but it can also get access like prompts, and it can also access data. So if you think about, like, we know that GenSpark has said they've got these, interesting data sets and stuff like that. If they're using that with something like MCP, maybe this is one of the things that's helping their models to, helping their agents to do so well, is that they're able to, be able to access the tool and some data of maybe how to use that tool, or, instructions or something like that. And I think this is sort of, key, is that while some of these ideas have come out, something like Anthropic, we know that Anthropic so far themselves hasn't really put out their own agents. They've talked about that they're going to have like a virtual collaborator at some point. I think Dario's teased that at Davos this year, and everyone got really interested, but then they've gone quiet, right? And we've seen them talk about the whole, they were one of the first ones to put out computer use. But again, like you said, they don't have a fully sort of worked out product. And maybe what everyone's trying to work out is like, okay, what is going to be the killer app for this? Is it going to be the generalist agent, or maybe the path that Microsoft's taking is where they're saying, hey, let's build one agent that does, inventory management. And that's a really big, thing that they know their customers want. And one agent that does, lead scoring or something like that, as opposed to going for the sort of generalist thing.
Right.
So, I think Microsoft is definitely really interesting what they've done. Google, let's see what they announce for next week, right? We've got to expect that they're going to announce some, big things there.
Well, yeah, I was talking with someone close to Google that said something like 80% of the announcements at Google next week are going to be around AI and agents, right? That's their cloud conference, but it's big on AI agents. So I guess we'll hear what their play is next week. But I think, for our viewers and listeners from enterprise, I think the other big thing we've noticed is that the big tech companies, Microsoft, you've mentioned, OpenAI, Amazon, they seem to be more focused on building agentic frameworks and capabilities for others, for their companies, for clients to be using. So they're less inclined to go out and create these general purpose agents that are doing everything, right, to bypass their customers and go directly to consumers. That's not their play. These are enterprise giants for the most part. I mean, Microsoft, for example, they fine-tune models to work on very specific enterprise cases. You mentioned that. We talked with Charles Lamanna, who leads their agent activity, last week, right, where Microsoft leveraged its deep understanding of Excel workflows and data analysis patterns to create an agent that aligns for how enterprise users actually work with data it can automatically, use Python code to process data, for example. We could go into, the dozen agents that they're using that they pre-built for specific purposes. OpenAI's Agent SDK, we saw that where they're opening up again, help letting developers use and build agents. Amazon's Nova Act, which just came out yesterday, which we wrote about on VentureBeat, right? Which you took a look at too, doing something very similar, right? Offering the capability to developers to use things like the web browser, and so got again another play that's very similar. Now I didn't see anything that jumped out for me as super differentiated. How about you?
To me, it looked very interesting, right? Like it was nice how both, it showed you what it was doing, but then also showed you like how it was thinking about the different things on the page and stuff like that. Let's see. One of the surprising things, and maybe this is why Amazon is jumping in here, is that none of the big companies have really given us, they've given us the model in the cloud, but they haven't given us the web browser in the cloud, right? You've had to run the web browser on your own sort of Docker instance or on your own local computer. So maybe Amazon, I just had a very brief look at Nova yesterday when I got in, and it does seem like, okay, if that's running in the cloud and now I can just ping it, that's pretty cool, right? Like that's something that I could then use to go off and do different tasks. And maybe, I give it like certain passwords to certain things. I'm not going to give it every sort of password, but maybe I'm going to, give it with a few things. Another one, actually, so, being back in the States, of course, you get to see all the marketing. So like coming in on the, freeway this morning, I've seen like, ads for a whole bunch of different things. And one of the big ones is Salesforce, right? Agent Force.
That's right. So I think that's the key for our listeners, Sam, is all these companies. So you go from ServiceNow, Oracle, SAP. So you mentioned Salesforce, Microsoft, OpenAI, Google. Right? They have these big enterprise ecosystems, AWS, with a lot of those companies having big applications. And I think Microsoft's point about the Microsoft graph, right, which gives Microsoft an edge on your relationship with your documents, calendars, your people and data, right, when you're coming to agentic tasks. The same thing goes for Salesforce, ServiceNow, right, Oracle, SAP, those big enterprise apps. They're going to be specializing. It looks like the Chinese companies, right? We call them Chinese, but obviously, there's
And there'll be others from other countries,
others,
yeah.
right?
Like
They are general agent companies that are fast and are out there with a lot of capabilities. But the question is, how accurate are they? How resilient they are, and how much differentiation they're going to have over time, right? And for the enterprise, these companies may actually not register.
I think one of the big things is to sort of decide, okay, can we just go, is our agent or the agents that we want generic enough that we can go with a Microsoft, we can go with an Agent Force or something like that, or a ServiceNow, right? Or do we need something really custom for our particular use case? And I think, a lot of companies are going to realize, inventory management is going to be maybe reasonably the same across, lots of different companies. And maybe things like marketing is going to be very similar across different companies. But there are going to be some things, that will be really unique to your thing. And that's when you're either going to need to basically find some kind of general agent that is really good. And, that's sort of going down the path of AGI and stuff like that. Or developing, your own thing, get with your own developers. I think each of these things is going to be really fascinating to see how it plays out. I do suspect that like the AGI path that everyone's talking about more and more may get possible, but may be so expensive that it's just not worth doing. Right. That for the time being, that if you realize, we can go with, Agent Force or Microsoft, or we can get our own guys to develop something based on something like Manus. Like the crazy thing was like the Manus prompts got leaked. Everyone could see how it was done. There's not a lot of IP to defend there, right? This is one of the things that I think is really interesting, but also dangerous with this kind of, game that everyone's playing at the moment.
Make some great points. I think one of the points he made was, that if you have maybe say inventory management is an example, or supply chain management, where you don't necessarily need your own special sauce type of, custom made applications. You'll maybe one conclusion is you'll go ahead and use ServiceNow's app or Oracle's app. But another conclusion is that if they're so general, you can just whip this up yourself. I mean, how complex is inventory management? I think there's all these questions around how SaaS and these other applications are going to survive. But one of the things that kind of bringing it back to GenSpark's super agent released yesterday, one of the fascinating examples was their example of how you could actually make a South Park episode using this agent, right? So it actually goes and actually tracks. You prompt it based on the news last week. So the agent goes out and finds the big news last week, which was that Signal Gate thing from the White House. It actually creates a screenplay, right? Because it has the agent has access to screenplays across the web, right? And then it creates short clips for each part of the screenplay through its video generator agent, and then has audio generation for each part of it, and it goes on and on. I mean, this stuff, right? I mean, it's going to put Hollywood out of business. It could put ServiceNow out of business, right? Or an Oracle out of business for each.
Look, it may come down to, yes, do you decide to either go with the generic things from your Microsoft, your ServiceNow, or how good is your CEO at vibe coding? That's maybe where it's going to be at.
All right. Any other conclusions, Sam?
No, I think I think it is really interesting time. I think we're seeing, a lot of these things. Don't forget, these are like the early, these are just the first ones. We're going to probably this year see a whole bunch of these come out. It's going to be really interesting to see, like, do the big tech companies jump in and make their own thing? Or do they sit out on the sidelines and go, yeah, let's just let them get all the, take all the arrows, be the pioneers, that kind of thing. And then see, like I keep saying, one of the things that I find fascinating and really interesting about Microsoft is that they seem to be much more focused on product market fit than having the best tech. Right. And I think that is a really killer kind of thing. So, I think for enterprises sort of looking at that, that's something definitely you should be thinking about. And if you're trying to develop, these agents, you really want to focus, okay, what is it that we need to do that's different than everyone else, for our particular organization?
Right. Okay, great. Well, 2025 was going to be the year of the agents. It's happening, and it's going to be exciting next week. Sam, you and I are going to be there in Las Vegas with Google Cloud Next, where they're going to be announcing stuff on agents. And so look forward to chatting with you about that.
Great. See you there.
Thanks, everyone, for watching. Like and subscribe for more insights into the latest in AI and tech. For deeper analysis and updates, visit VentureBeat.com and sign up for our newsletters. Stay informed and ahead of the curve.